a 21-year-old woman chased a stranger down the highway with a loaded gun, and minutes later, an unarmed man was dying beside his truck. She told police it was self-defense, that the gun accidentally went off during a struggle. But when investigators replayed the 911 calls in court, prosecutors claimed those recordings exposed a very different story, one that would eventually send her to prison for life. What began as a simple traffic accident in Georgia slowly turned into one of the state's most disturbing murder trials. Because the deeper investigators looked into the case, the more one question haunted the courtroom. Was Hannah Payne truly defending herself? Or did she create the deadly situation herself? The night of May 7th, 2019, should have ended like thousands of other traffic accidents across America. Insurance information, police reports, maybe a citation. Instead, a young woman who claimed she was trying to help would later be convicted of murder. Before the shooting, before the trial, before national headlines, Hannah Payne and Kenneth Herring were complete strangers living entirely separate lives. Hannah Payne was 21 years old and worked in property management. Friends described her as cautious and responsible. She had recently obtained a concealed carry permit after turning 21, legally allowing her to carry a handgun in Georgia. To Payne, the weapon represented safety and protection. But prosecutors later argued it gave her the confidence to escalate a situation that never should have become violent. Kenneth Herring was 62 years old. He had spent years working physically demanding jobs, including air conditioning and mechanical work. People who knew him described him as quiet and hardworking. On the night everything happened, Herring was driving his red Dodge Dakota through Clayton County, Georgia. Then in one sudden moment, their lives collided. Herring ran a red light near Interstate 285 and crashed into an 18-wheeler on Clark Howell Highway. The collision caused visible damage and stopped traffic, but it wasn't catastrophic. Witnesses at the scene immediately noticed something strange about Herring's behavior. He appeared confused, disoriented, detached from what was happening around him. One of the witnesses was an off-duty corrections officer named Terry Robinson, who had medical experience working in a prison infirmary. Robinson later testified that Herring looked medically unwell. His eyes appeared reddish-orange and he seemed mentally lost. At first, Robinson believed Herring might be intoxicated, but he also considered another possibility: diabetic shock. That distinction would later become incredibly important, because diabetic shock can closely resemble intoxication. Confusion, slow reactions, unstable behavior, and disorientation are all common symptoms. A person suffering from it may not fully understand what's happening around them, but standing there at the crash scene that night, nobody knew exactly what was wrong. They only knew something seemed off. That's when Hannah Payne made her first 911 call. At first, everything sounded normal. Payne calmly explained there had been an accident involving a pickup truck and a semi-truck. She sounded cooperative and helpful, simply trying to make sure police were on the way. Nothing in the call hinted at the tragedy that was about to unfold. For nearly 20 minutes, everyone remained at the crash scene waiting for officers to arrive. But police still hadn't shown up. Then suddenly, Kenneth Herring climbed back into his truck and drove away. The witnesses were shocked. Terry Robinson immediately called 911 again, sounding frustrated and alarmed. While speaking to dispatchers, he mentioned something that would later become major evidence in the murder trial. He said the woman in the Jeep, Hannah Payne, had turned around and started following Herring. At first, it may have sounded reasonable, a witness trying to help police locate a fleeing driver. But over the next several minutes, prosecutors argued Payne crossed a line from concerned citizen to active pursuer. As she drove behind Herring, Payne called 911 herself again. That phone call would later become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire trial. At first, Payne told dispatchers she believed Herring was drunk and dangerous. She said she didn't want him hurting anyone else on the road. Then the dispatcher asked her a simple question: "Can you get his tag number?" That should have ended the situation. But Payne responded, "No, but I'm catching up to him right now." Prosecutors later argued that sentence changed everything, because from that moment forward, dispatchers repeatedly instructed her not to continue chasing the truck. Not once, multiple times. The operator warned her to stop following Herring and stay safe, but Payne ignored the instructions. Even after she successfully obtained Herring's license plate number, the very reason she claimed she was following him, she still refused to back off. Dispatchers told her police were already responding to the original crash scene and instructed her to return there. But Payne made her position very clear. She believed Herring was dangerous, and she wasn't going to stop following him. To prosecutors, that mattered enormously, because Hannah Payne was not a police officer. She had no legal authority to detain Kenneth Herring, no authority to stop his vehicle, no authority to confront him with a firearm. Yet she kept pursuing him anyway. For roughly a mile, Payne followed Herring through traffic until they reached the intersection of Riverdale Road and Forest Parkway, and this was the moment prosecutors said the situation became irreversible. Instead of simply observing from a safe distance, Payne used her Jeep to cut off Herring's truck. She blocked him in, then she got out of her vehicle, still carrying a loaded handgun. The dispatcher remained on the phone, trying to understand what was happening. Then chaos erupted. According to Payne's version of events, she approached Herring's truck intending only to stop him until police arrived. She later claimed Herring suddenly became aggressive, grabbed her wrist, ripped her shirt, and pulled her toward the truck. She said she feared for her life. Then came the gunshot. A single bullet struck Kenneth Herring in the abdomen. Within seconds, the entire situation transformed from a traffic incident into a homicide investigation. But what happened immediately after the shooting became one of the most controversial parts of the case, because prosecutors argued Payne's reaction on the 911 call didn't sound like panic or shock. Instead, they claimed she sounded defensive. At one point, the dispatcher reminded her, "You were not supposed to follow him," and Payne immediately responded, "He hit my car." Prosecutors later pointed out that Payne never screamed in panic or desperately asked medics to save Herring's life. Instead, they argued she focused almost entirely on justifying her actions. When officers arrived at the intersection, they found Kenneth Herring inside his truck suffering from a gunshot wound to the abdomen. Witnesses immediately pointed officers toward Hannah Payne, the woman with the gun. Police secured the weapon and began separating witnesses. But investigators quickly noticed something unusual about Payne's demeanor. Witnesses later testified she appeared strangely calm. One bystander said Payne acted like she believed she had done nothing wrong. Another described her as emotionless, even though a man had just been fatally shot only feet away from her. Payne insisted the shooting was accidental. According to her story, Herring grabbed her wrist and threatened her, and during the struggle, the gun accidentally discharged. Investigators documented scratches on Payne's neck, redness on her wrist, and torn clothing that seemed consistent with some kind of altercation. For a short time, those injuries appeared to support her claims. But then, investigators started analyzing the forensic evidence more closely. The handgun belonged to Payne. Her DNA was found all over the weapon. Testing for Kenneth Herring's DNA came back inconclusive. And perhaps most damaging of all, detectives testified the firearm included safety features that made an accidental discharge far less likely. Prosecutors argued the trigger required deliberate pressure. In other words, someone had to intentionally pull it. The defense pushed back aggressively. They pointed to the knife found inside Herring's truck. They emphasized Payne's injuries and argued she was a frightened young woman trying to stop someone she genuinely believed was dangerous. But prosecutors viewed the case completely differently. To them, this was never self-defense. Because self-defense becomes much harder to claim when you are the person who initiated the confrontation. And prosecutors argued that step by step, decision by decision, Hannah Payne created the deadly situation herself. She chose to chase Herring. She chose to ignore dispatch instructions. She chose to block his truck. She chose to approach him with a loaded firearm. Then came another devastating blow to the defense. Toxicology reports revealed Kenneth Herring was not drunk, no alcohol, no illegal drugs, nothing supporting Payne's belief that she was pursuing a dangerous, intoxicated driver. Investigators later acknowledged Herring may have been suffering from a medical condition like diabetic shock, which could explain his confusion and behavior after the crash. Suddenly, the image of a reckless drunk driver began collapsing. And in its place emerged something far more tragic. The judge ultimately sentenced Hannah Payne to life in prison with the possibility of parole, plus an additional 13 years for firearm and false imprisonment charges. Most of her adult life will now be spent behind bars. Today, Payne continues appealing her conviction, arguing legal mistakes were made during trial. But for Kenneth Herring's family, those arguments change nothing. A man survived the original crash, only to die minutes later after being chased down by someone who believed she was justified in taking control of the situation. Because in the end, this case was never only about a gunshot. It was about escalation, about what happens when ordinary people decide to take the law into their own hands, and how one moment of fear, anger, or misplaced righteousness can destroy multiple lives forever.